Hello and welcome back to Black Doctors Podcast. I am Steven, your host. This week on the show, we're going to continue with the discussion we started last week with Dr. Robert Ray. He's sharing his experience as a resident where he stood up for what he believed in despite the backlash that he experienced from his residency leadership as well as hospital human resources. We started the conversation last week, definitely a lot of gems and takeaways that will help all of us, no matter where we are at any stage in our career. Unfortunately, some sad news before we get started. Over the weekend, specifically Friday, December 1st, Dr. Jamal Dixon passed away. He is an internal medicine physician. He was actually a guest on the podcast back in season 3, episode 14, and he shared his battle with cancer. As a resident physician, he found out that he had an enormous GIST tumor, gastrointestinal stromal tumor, and he shared his experiences of being on the other side of the table from becoming a physician to now being the patient. And it was an incredible discussion that we had. What people don't know is that when we had that discussion or when we recorded that podcast episode, I was actually being worked up for cancer. Thank God it was negative. And after the episode, he stayed on and we chatted for a little bit, and he gave so much great advice and encouragement and support. He'd made it the mission of his life to support caregivers that are taking care of their loved ones. And he founded this caregiver wellness program. An incredible individual, incredible physician. Will forever be grateful to him for the change he affected, for what he shared with all those around him that knew him, for the way he was so selfless. And even when he was going through, some of the worst that you can experience as a patient, he was still concerned about supporting and giving back to those around him and to those family members of people that are patients. So to Dr. Jamal Dixon of the Caregivers Sanctuary, rest in peace, brother. After that moment of silence, we're going to jump into today's episode of the Black Doctors Podcast. Thanks for tuning in.
And so I continued to do what I had done since I had gotten there because my questions hadn't been answered. Like, why is this changing? Why am I being told one thing at one time and then another? And if it's not a residency problem, HR doesn't come to grand rounds. Because what we were discussing was they weren't telling me that I couldn't wear my bracelet anymore because it was already in writing that I could wear my bracelet. They were telling me that I couldn't wear anything that said Black Lives Matter to grand round or our education, like our residency education. And to me, that, like, if I can wear the bracelet in the emergency department when I'm taking care of patients and the public, then why in this like classroom setting can I? Why it was all very confusing.
Yeah. Something's fishy.
And so I continued, and they sent an email in January. He said, I saw that you're wearing a Black Lives Matter hoodie to grand rounds, so I just want to make sure you understood that we're saying that this isn't allowed. And so I sent a very long email basically expressing that I felt like they were avoiding the true nature of the discussion. They didn't want to answer any of my questions when I asked them about like why the change. I felt like I was being singled out. I was feeling very unsupported, very just overall bad about the entire situation. And so I have questions. Can I wear things that say all lives matter or white lives matter or trans lives matter? Can I wear these other things that are against the dress code? Or is it just BLM that we're focused on? Because that's what it seems like to me. And once again, he didn't answer any of the questions.
And this was the program leadership
director.
Or HR?
Yep.
Just program. Okay.
And so at that point is when he said, okay, well then we're just going to you have to meet with HR. And so we did in February, first day of Black History Month, February 1st. And, I won't go through the entire conversation that's in the blog, but it was basically the same things. I had the same questions, except this time, they started to provide a little more, some answers, not what I was expecting. So in my head, how I thought this would play out was, this is like an education issue. Like, they just don't understand like the perspective. They don't understand like the dichotomy that they're creating. Like, we're going to have an educated discussion about this, and then, it'll be an ongoing thing, but, we could reach some sort of common ground or some kind of understanding, or maybe they can explain to me a reason why this is changing, and, that makes sense. And then, maybe I can, come to their side. But that is not what happened. It was supposed to be, my impression, just me and the HR representative.
Yeah.
But it was, I show up to the meeting and it's me and the HR representative, and then my program director, the assistant program director, and our program coordinator, all of who I know are not in agreement with me, which, I thought was odd in the first place, because it's like, especially with human resources, that is very problematic from the power dynamic, from the whole situation. It was just, I was like, from jump, I was like, yeah, I know exactly what this is. And so I go through, went through the dress code. I highlighted it. I looked at, I didn't see anything that was applying in the way that they were trying to apply it to me. And so I asked them, like, what part of this dress code are you saying applies to what I'm wearing? And she said, I think it's like line 21 or something. And it's basically the casual workday dress code policy, which is what they're saying Grand Rounds is. And the very last bullet, there's at least 10 bullets. It says you can't wear anything that's offensive, political, or an advertisement. And I said, oh, okay, that's interesting. So which one are you saying it is? Because I don't think it's any of those things. And this was when it started to make sense to me, where I like made that connection, like, okay, this is coming. I think this is coming from you, because my program director jumps in and starts to say, like, well, if they have a PAC and you can donate money to their PAC and then they can go and lobby, and that sounds pretty political to me. And I instantly was like, well, that doesn't make sense, because we can go make a PAC right now. It'll take probably less than 5 minutes, and we can call it whatever we want. We can do whatever we want with it. But just because someone has a PAC and chooses it to name it or use it for, that doesn't make whatever they name it about political. Just like, you can make a PAC about anything. And, they didn't. So I like laid out this example about the NFL, and they have PACs, but we don't just assume that we're supporting their politics when we wear their jerseys or their memorabilia. And, he didn't really have a good response to that. And so then I asked the HR representative, I said, okay, so he says that this is a political issue. What do you say? And she said, well, I think it can be interpreted as offensive. And I was not expecting that, because even if someone really thought that, which I'm sure I know that people do think that, I never thought someone would have the gall to say it out loud in an HR meeting from an HR representative. It's just like HR 101. Like, I don't even think that word is supposed to be in the vocabulary. And so then I'm like, oh, okay, well, we have to dive into this. And so we kind of have a little back and forth, and, it just really seemed like they had their mind made up. It was very frustrating being in those meetings, because, we're all educated people, and I'm expecting to have these like educated conversations where I ask like what I think is a reasonable question. Like, okay, so we have all these trainings, we have all this stuff for LGBTQ trans communities, their underrepresentation, their poor outcomes in healthcare. We're saying we care about all of those things. And I agree with that. So you're saying we can wear pronoun pins. You're saying we can, these things. How do you not draw the comparison between this group of people and the group of people that I'm talking about? Because to me, the oppression is the same.
Yeah.
So how is this okay, but this isn't? So you're telling me that this isn't okay because it's political or offensive. At the time, there was nothing more political than LGBTQ rights. Just like 2 weeks prior to this, they had voted on gay marriage again. There's all this, things with, what Tennessee is doing, well, what they were doing at the time with the drag readings and the drag brunches, and, the bathrooms, and, it was a constant everyday thing. Nothing is, more in politics than that. And they were like, well, we want to, be supportive to that community and, improve their health outcomes and let them know that, we'll take care of them here. And I said, okay, what about Black people? And silence. And so we're having this back and forth, and I have all these questions that I think are reasonable, but their answers are essentially like, no, like this is the rule. So there is no like real discussion, which was basically like beating my head against the wall. And so at the very end, I'm like, okay, this meeting isn't going anywhere. We've been here for like an hour. I've laid out like all of these things, and you're just kind of continue to just shut it down. Like, this is the law. This is the rule. This is what it's going to be. So we're not going to come to any common ground. So I will follow the dress code, even though I don't agree with the dress code or the interpretation, if everybody has to follow the dress code. But I'm not going to be singled out. And the HR representative said, yes, like that's why we have these policies. Like the policies are for everyone in the hospital. And my program director said, that's ridiculous. And that's when the light really went off, because that was just the most unreasonable response I think you could possibly have in this situation. I feel like I was being reasonable, saying, okay, if everyone has to follow the rules, then I'll follow the rules. Fine. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to discuss how this could, be problematic. But if everyone has to follow the rules, then I'll follow the rules. And then your response to that is that it's ridiculous that everyone has to follow the rules. So, you have to make everyone follow the dress code and all of the residencies and all of the meetings. That's like the definition of fair. And so he went on like a small tangent about it. And she was like, no, everyone has to follow the rules. And I told her, I said, they're not, like, you can see his reaction. They're not going to make everyone follow the rules. They're not going to. I'm telling you how this is going to play out. And she said, no, like, we'll make sure of it.
And what were the repercussions?
Like if they didn't?
Or for you, if you didn't get on board, what were they were threatening you with?
They didn't have any at the time. There was no, like, if you don't, then we're going to do this. Or if you, then, I didn't really think there needed to be, because like I said, if everyone has to, then I'll do it. And I said, they're not going to make everyone follow the rules. She said, okay, well, you keep track, of everyone. So once again, put the duty on me to do their job. So I keep track. Yeah, I keep track of everyone who's breaking the dress code policy, and then, let them know, and they'll do something about that. So I just felt like they kept reiterating, like, I knew that this was not about the dress code based on how they were acting and the things that they were saying. But, people, they'll say whatever they have to say. And they're like, oh, this is the dress code. This is the dress code policy. And so later that evening, so I go from that meeting to grand rounds, and it's Black History Month, which, you know what that means? That means we're going to have DEI grand rounds in February. So now I have to listen to these same people talk to me about the importance of, representation and inclusion in the emergency department. My God. And I'd sit there for 3 hours and try not to bomb it. And then they sent out an email later that evening. It's titled Administrative Updates. Okay. This is going to be the email. They're going to tell everyone about the dress code. Nope. Bunch of other stuff. Not a word about the dress code. I said, okay. Once again, they don't care about the dress code. So the next week comes, and they didn't send out I I wore a hoodie that said Black Lives Matter in sign language because they didn't tell everyone that they had to follow the dress code. And so I was very clear. I wasn't going to be singled out. You either have to make everyone do it and make a statement so that everyone is doing it, or I'm going to just continue to do what everyone else is doing, which is wear casual clothes to grand round. And so then that evening they sent out, and after that grand rounds, they sent out an email about the dress code, and the residents were all confused, just as confused as I was, because there was no dress code at grand rounds. You came in shorts, you came in sweats, pajamas, like whatever. And they're like, where is this coming from? So there's a, small uproar in the residency, but continue on. And, there's a lot more details in the blog. I don't want to keep rambling on. It's easy to keep going, but they essentially, nobody follows the dress code. There's faculty members that aren't following the dress code. There's, residents. I don't even think most of the residents read the dress code because they knew that this was not going to be like enforced on them. They weren't concerned. And so I did what I was advised to do, and I kept a running list of everybody that was breaking the dress code and how they were breaking the dress code. And honestly, that felt terrible because, these are like my friends and like my mentors that I'm like keeping this list of. But I know that if I don't keep the list, then they're going to just claim that it didn't happen, claim that. But then keeping it, makes me feel like, I'm
a snitch,
snitching on them or whatever it is. But it just was not a good environment to be in. And so we ended up having like more meetings with HR because at the end of that meeting, I told them that I didn't feel like I had resolution and I wanted to, speak to someone else about how this dress code is being interpreted. And she shut me down. She said, I'm HR. You don't get to speak to higher ups, which once again, HR 101, I didn't think that was in their vocabulary.
Right.
So I was like, oh, but I wasn't just going to listen to her because that's what she said. Like I knew that there was someone else to talk to. And so I, emailed the director of DEI for the network, who I had come to know because I had been doing lots of DEI work in the network. And she had a meeting with me. And I never went to a meeting alone after that first one.
Okay.
Because I was like, one, I'm going to need witnesses because in the state of Pennsylvania, it's illegal to record someone without their consent and knowledge. And two, I just needed that support there because clearly they were coming in groups. And so, I had, luckily for me, some really supportive faculty and attendings. And so they would go to the meetings with me. And so, I told her the whole story and she said, "This discrimination. This is terrible." So we have two options to deal with this. One is through HR. I know her boss. We can get a meeting with her and her boss. I don't think they know the background of the rest of this that's going on. So I want them to hear the rest of it. And she said, two, graduate medical education, you can file a claim of discrimination. And I said, okay. And so we kind of took it step by step. And so we had this meeting with that same HR lady and her boss. Sorry, the HR representative and her boss. And I told them the whole story. And they were flabbergasted by the stuff that the program administration was saying about making this like an HR problem. She told me that the only conversation she had with my program director, Dr. Quinn, was in October. He called her and asked if it was okay if it was against the dress code for a resident to wear a shirt that said Black Lives Matter to grand round. Now, she was on vacation, she told me during this call, and it was just a couple minutes long. And she said yes. And he basically said, okay. And that was the discussion. That was his definition of due diligence. And so they were all upset that my program administration basically threw HR under the bus and kind of roped them into it. And so I was like, so you're telling me that you guys weren't even on the same page, and then you agreed to have this meeting with me about this before you even knew any of the background information or any of this stuff. And, I told her what she said and why it was hurtful and why it was offensive. And they were like, okay, we need to have we're going to do all these things, yada, yada, yada. And that just never happened. They were supposed to follow up. They were supposed to do all these things. I told them at that time about the other residents and the faculty members that were not following the dress code, so they knew about it. Nothing happened. Just like I predicted, right. Nothing happened. So fast forward, a lot of stuff is kind of going on in between with rumors and, my program administration telling people that I need to watch my back or I'm going to get fired. Other ridiculous things that they would say about not wanting residents like me there anymore for the future matches, whatever that means. And it was just miserable. And so the residents start talking amongst themselves, separate from me. I basically had, withdrawn from all social activities. And they were like, okay, well, no one's enforcing this dress code and we think it's stupid. So we're just not going to follow the dress code, right? And they're like, yeah, we're not following the dress code. So they were intentionally breaking the dress code to see if anyone would say anything to them. And so I hear about this in the springtime and I'm like, so I start talking to the residents. I'm like, so no one has said anything to you guys? You wear ripped jeans or sweats or whatever. And they say, no one's ever said anything to me. We joke about it. We were just like, oh yeah, the dress code that nobody follows. So I said, okay, was very clear that I was not going to be singled out and I don't feel like I'm being treated fairly. So I wear a hoodie. It says Black Lives Matter. And I arrive to Grand Rounds and I get off the elevator. They're sitting in a table, right in front of the elevator. She sees me, she gets this look and I walk to my seat and she follows in right behind me. I mean, literally, I sit down, I put my bag down, and then she's in my ear. And she says, you need to take that off or you need to leave. And granted, she just walked by handful of people that were clearly breaking the dress code, wearing sweats, wearing ripped jeans, wearing caps, just at my table, not even just in the entire room, just at my table. At the same time, she's wearing sandals, which is against the dress code. So I look her in her eye and I say, I will take this hoodie off and follow the dress code when you make every other single person in here follow the dress code. And not until then will I even consider taking this hoodie off. And that was the first time the entire year that they enforced the dress code. So they start going up to people and texting people and making them leave Grand Rounds to go change, including faculty members, right? Because faculty members have also not been. And so everyone is confused. There's this whole ruckus when we're supposed to be learning, right? And so they have to go home and change or take stuff off. And everyone's very confused. Faculty members had to leave and go home. And so then she texts me and says, okay, everyone that's breaking the dress code has been notified and it's been addressed. Can you take your hoodie off or go home and change? Now, I had been looking at this dress code for months at this time. So I knew it. I knew everything about the dress code to make sure that I was following it and to keep track. And I assumed since they had kept referring me to the dress code that they had also read it and would also know what was against the dress code, flip-flops, sandals, sweatpants, hats, graphic t-shirts, etc. And so everyone had not been addressed that was breaking the dress code. There was people sitting next to me and across from me that also, and so I replied that actually, no, they haven't been addressed. People are still not following the dress code, but once again, you're worried about me. So when everyone has to follow it, I'll follow it. And so then she gets upset and texts my program director, who starts using Tiger Text or the hospital, texting, paging system to notify me on my phone once again while we're supposed to be learning, about this. And so eventually I am just like, okay. And so I take it off and I hang it on the back of my chair. And to me, it was like, I always knew that it wasn't about the dress code.
Right.
And this was just the proof to everybody, because they did not care about the dress code. As long as I was not wearing anything Black Lives Matter, the rest of the dress code didn't matter. It was never addressed. They never cared about it until I wore something that said Black Lives Matter and refused to do what they told me to do until they did what they originally said they were going to do, which was apply it to everyone. And so that was one of the worst days to, be blatantly singled out like that in front of everybody. Yeah. But then at the same time, it was also so reassuring, because I knew the entire time what this was about. And they not only just proved it to me, they proved it to everybody else that was in that room. And so, I go on about my day, and then the next day they send out an email. Once again, now they're talking about the dress code. Like, just a reminder, after 2.5 months of us not enforcing it, here's the dress code. And, they CC'd the HR representatives and some other like program administration, which I took as a, they're like, oh, here he is again. Like, this is, him, he's the problem. Like, what are we going to do about this? And so for the first time, I hate reply all. I hate reply all emails.
You replied
for
all?
For the first time in residency, I replied all. And I wrote an email. Basically, I laid out like the highlights about the dress code. And that was the first time that the residents kind of had an idea of what was going on. They didn't, some people had heard rumors that the dress code was about like BLM. Some people thought it was about other people that like wore like shorts that were too short. Some people had no idea. And so I basically, expressed that they were trying to single me out. I told them that I didn't think it was fair and that everyone had to follow it. That's when they sent out that email in February. Nobody really paid attention to the dress code and nobody enforced it. And so then I explained kind of what happened the rest of that day. And, and then that's when people started to have an idea. And that obviously led to another HR meeting, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I can see that coming.
And, so on and so forth. So that was kind of like the spark notes of how the year went. There are some other things that, didn't really make it into the blog that happened. Like, for instance, they knew that I was going to post the blog because I told them during, when I met with the DIO and that second time I met with HR, I told them, I basically explained that when you start as a resident, there's nothing you can do. You're trapped. It's incredibly difficult to change residencies. It's almost impossible to do it without like a strong recommendation from your program administration. So there's really nothing you can do. You just kind of have to suck it up and you have to do whatever you're told. I said, but the interesting thing about the end of residency is the tables kind of turn, because I don't have any obligation to this hospital, to this program, like once I'm done. And I had kept I saved all of my evaluations, all of the objective things that I needed to complete residency.
Yeah.
And all of the subjective things that people had even said about me. And so they had no grounds to fire me based on merit. They had no grounds to not let me finish.
That's huge.
It was all, I had the paper trail. So you guys, I think that I'm right. You guys think that you're right. The difference is that I am at least open to the possibility that I could be wrong, even though I really don't think I am. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write it all down and then I'm going to put it on the internet and then we'll let the public decide. And they said, okay, do what you think you have to do. So they weren't surprised by the blog because they knew that it was going to happen because I told them months before that I was doing it.
Yeah.
They were surprised by the response and they only cared. They only acted because of the response that they got from the public.
Wow. And what was that, from your interpretation, kind of the backlash or the response that happened?
So I remember, so I posted it before I technically graduated. I finished my last shift in the ER on, I think it was a Wednesday or a Thursday. And then graduation was on Friday. And technically we were under contract for another like week or two, but our program after graduation, they didn't make us work anymore. And so I finished that shift, and I remember, like, obviously I know going into it, like, that at the end of the shift, like, that's when I'm going to post it. And so I remember like being anxious, and I remember I was sweating and I was shaking because what I didn't know, I really expected people to respond in a negative fashion. And I expected, especially because of like the area that we lived in and the community, that I know how, bad this could have gone, death threats, people like leaving negative comments and, all of that. And so I expected a lot of that. And then I expected some of the other like positive support as well. Honestly, after how the year had been going and the kind of mindset I was in, I was like living in this like negative environment. And so that's my expectation. And it was the opposite of what I expected. Luckily for me, I had a lot of support, from my residents, from my co-residents. They all reposted it. They all offered their support. They all read it. A lot of the faculty members, reached out to me, not, online or over the phone. And, a lot of the people that I worked with, my coworkers, the nurses, the techs, the other residents in the hospital, not in my program, the attendings, they all, reposted it, talked about, how they thought I was a really good resident, how and so I think that, that was the kind of initial wave, which I was very appreciative of. But then the people that didn't know me started to read it, and then it started to really kind of gain traction and, overwhelming support. Obviously it's not all that, which is fine, but overwhelming positive response, which was the opposite really of what I expected. And I think we're kind of trained to believe, especially in the moment, or I guess conditioned, maybe not trained, to feel like we're alone or you're by yourself.
Yeah.
And you always know, like, I know I'm not the only one experiencing this, but it just feels like you're alone. And so the number of people that reached out to me, people of color, people that are marginalized, that said, I experienced the same exact thing, or I experienced something just like this, or I'm going through this right now. And I'm glad that you said something, because I was so beat down, so exhausted, or so scared that I couldn't. And I've always regretted not saying something or not doing something. I just put my head down and move on, or, the same exact thing that I did, when that orange comment was made.
Right.
And I felt like that's when I think that's what I was most proud of, is being able to kind of lay out this landscape for other people to come and share their stories and their experiences and their trauma, and kind of have this community where they didn't have to feel like they were alone anymore. And, there are a lot of people who trained or were training at Lehigh Valley that reached out to me and was like, oh, I know exactly the person you're talking about. Or this happened to me. And that some of these things, even when I was there, that I didn't know about, right? Because you're encouraged to keep it to yourself. and, people from other programs, like all across the country. And so there was, I didn't expect as much as that as I got, which when I look back is what I'm like most proud of.
Yeah. I'm sure, writing it and posting it had to have been cathartic, and that overwhelming support. Because like you mentioned, we're all going through, we probably all have a similar situation or story. And maybe you're the person that took the bracelet off and took the hoodie off and just followed the rules. Or maybe you're somebody that spoke truth to power. And I know your story kind of helps give people a lay of the land and realize you're not alone, and what you can do to kind of combat some of these experiences. I wanted to highlight two things. One, when you were in those meetings, if you're in a situation like this, you need to know the rules and the policies better than the people that are trying to enforce them. There's so many times your direct leadership will try to enforce something that's, beyond their purview, whether that's, it's clear this is an HR issue, plus minus, or, hospital rules and regulations that supersede that paternal or maternal position of your program leadership. And realize that they're not the end all be all for a lot of these. You sign a contract with a hospital or some kind of program, and there's a specific way that these situations need to play out. So you got to protect yourself, know your risk exposure. And then the other part I want to touch on, Robert, because clearly, you had a track record of being a phenomenal resident. You had the subjective and objective data that you knew you were finishing this residency program. And just know, you're standing the same. When I was an anesthesia resident, we had a whole system. It's all written. It's got to be written down, right? For it to be a program. You're going to get evaluated X number of months. If you get X number of bad evaluations, they now have standing to delay your graduation. It's written down somewhere. Get that information, know where you are, and know what you have to lose, depending on the choices that you make.
Absolutely. And, that was something that I definitely had to weigh on. And, I did this because it's what I thought was right and what was right for me in the situation. I in no way would expect someone else to, I knew that I was risking a lot, and that even though I had all of this data to back, my performance as a resident, that if they became hateful enough or they really wanted to, they could try to fire me and make my life more difficult in that way. Now, obviously, there is legal repercussions to things like that, but I know that I like to think that I was privileged in the way that I didn't have a family or anybody relying on me.
Yeah.
That I only had to take care of myself and my cat, which I was confident I would be able to do. And not everyone has, that privilege either. So, there was a lot of, thought that went into this, but I definitely made sure that I understand the rules that were set out for the hospital, ask questions about the interpretation, and made sure I also knew the rules and guidelines for like residency and the ACGME and graduating and finishing my program.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Robert Ray, thank you for coming on the podcast. Thank you for sharing your story. You need to start reading the blog, because it lays everything out so clearly, and then you kind of filling in some of these issues and just incredibly powerful story. Love to have you on the show anytime. We'll be waiting for the book when you decide to write it.
Oh goodness. Thanks for having me. I don't know about a book, but you never know what happens in the future. So
awesome. Tune in next week to the Black Doctors Podcast. We're here because representation matters. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the podcast. Tune in next week. We'll be back. In the meantime, I want to give some updates on the promotion or the partnership we're doing with the Student National Medical Association. We are donating $5 for each review that we receive until the end of the year. So we started out with, I think, 90 reviews on iTunes, and I think we're up to 93 or 94. So, we're donating up to $600. So please share with friends, family members, whoever. And all you do is leave a review, leave a comment, leave anything. And for each one of those, we'll give a $5 donation to the Student National Medical Association to help celebrate their 60th year anniversary. On Spotify, we start out with 20 reviews or ratings. We're up to 25. So whichever venue you choose to listen to the podcast on, go ahead and leave a review, leave a ranking, and we will use that to help support the Student National Medical Association. Thanks for tuning in to the Black Doctors Podcast. We're here because representation matters.